The Ghost in the Mill by Harriet Beecher Stowe. "Come, Sam, tell us a story," said I, as Harry and I crept to his knees in the glow of the bright evening firelight, while Aunt Lois was busily rattling the tea things, and Grandmamma, at the other end of the fireplace, was quietly setting the heel of a blue mixed yarn stocking. In those days we had no magazines and daily papers, each reeling off a serial story. Once a week the Columbian Sentinel came from Boston with its slender stock of news and editorial, but all the multiform devices, pictorial, narrative, and poetical, which keep the mind of the present generation ablaze with excitement, had not then even an existence. There was no theater, no opera. There were in Oldtown no parties or balls, except perhaps the annual election or Thanksgiving festival, and when winter came and the sun went down at 4:30 and left the long dark hours of evening to be provided for, the necessity of amusement became urgent. Hence, in those days, chimney-corner storytelling became an art and an accomplishment. Society then was full of traditions and narratives which had all the uncertain glow and shifting mystery of the firelight hearth upon them. They were told to sympathetic audiences by the rising and falling light of the solemn embers, with the hearth crickets filling up every pause. Then the aged told their stories to the young, tales of early life, tales of war and adventure, of forest days, of Indian captivities and escapes, of bears and wildcats and panthers, of rattlesnakes, of witches and wizards, and strange and wonderful dreams and appearances and providences. In those days of early Massachusetts, faith and credence were in the very air. 2/3 of New England was then dark, unbroken forests, through which tangled paths and mysterious winter wind groaned and shrieked and howled with weird noises and unaccountable clamors. Along the iron-bound shore, the stormful Atlantic raved and thundered and dashed its moaning waters, as if to deaden and deafen any voice that might tell of the settled life of the old civilized world, and shut us forever into the wilderness. A good storyteller in those days was always sure of a warm seat at the hearthstone and the delightful homage of children, and in all Oldtown there was no better storyteller than Sam Lawson. "Do tell us a story," said Harry, pressing upon him, and opening very wide blue eyes, in which undoubtful faith shone as in a mirror, "and let it be something strange and different from common."
"Well, I know lots of strange things," said Sam, looking mysteriously into the fire. "Why, I know things that if I should tell, why, people might say they weren't so. But then they is so for all that."
"Oh, do tell us."
"Why, I should scare you to death, maybe," said Sam doubtingly.
"Oh, pooh, no you wouldn't," we both burst out at once. But Sam was possessed by a reticent spirit, and loved dearly to be wooed and importuned, and so he only took up the great kitchen tongs and smote on the hickory forestick when it flew apart in the middle and scattered a shower of clear bright coals all over the hearth. "Mercy on us, Sam Lawson," said Aunt Lois in an indignant voice, spinning round from her dishwashing.
"Don't you worry a grain, Miss Lois," said Sam composedly. "I see that there stick was eaten almost in two, and I thought I'd just settle it. I'll sweep up the coals now," he added, vigorously applying a turkey wing to the purpose, as he knelt on the hearth, his spare, lean figure glowing in the blaze of the firelight, and getting quite flushed with exertion. "There now," he said, when he had brushed over and under and between the fire-irons, and pursued the retreating ashes so far into the red, fiery citadel that his finger-ends were burning and tingling. "That there's done now, as well as Hepsy herself could have done it. I allers sweeps up the hearth. I think it's part of the man's business when he makes the fire. But Hepsy's so used to seeing me a-doing on it, that she don't see no kind of merit in it. It's just as Parson Lothrop said in his sermon, folks allers overlook their common marcies."
"But come, Sam, that story," said Harry and I coaxingly, pressing upon him and pulling him down into his seat in the corner.
"Lordy massy, these 'ere young'uns," said Sam. "There's never no contentin' on 'em, and they just swallers it as a dog does a gob of meat, and they're all ready for another. What do yer want to hear now?" Now the fact was that Sam's stories had been told us so often that they were all arranged and ticketed in our minds. We knew every word of them, and could set him right if he varied a hair from the usual track, and still the interest in them was unabated. Still we shivered and clung to his knees at the mysterious parts, and felt gentle, cold chills run down our spines at appropriate places. We were always in the most receptive and sympathetic condition. Tonight, in particular, was one of those thundering, stormy ones, when the winds appeared to be holding a perfect mad carnival over my grandfather's house. They yelled and squealed round the corners, they collected in troops, and came tumbling and roaring down chimney. They shook and tattled the buttery door, and the sink-room door, and the cellar door, and the chamber door, with a constant undertone of squeak and clatter, as if at every door were a cold, discontented spirit, tired of the chill outside, and longing for the warmth and comfort within. "Well, boys," said Sam confidentially, "what'll ye have?" "Tell us! Come down! Come down!" we both shouted with one voice. This was, in our mind, an A number 1 among Sam's stories. "Ye mustn't be frightened now," said Sam paternally. "Oh, no, we aren't frightened, ever," said we both in one breath. "Not when ye go down the cellar after cider?" said Sam with severe scrutiny. "If ye should be down cellar, and the candle should go out now." "I ain't," said I ain't afraid of anything. I never knew what it was to be afraid in my life." "Well, then," said Sam, "I'll tell ye. This yere's what Cap'n Eb Sawin told me when I was a boy about your bigness, I reckon. Cap'n Eb Sawin was a most remarkable man. Your grandfather knew him very well, and he was a deacon in the church in Dedham afore he died. He was at Lexington when the first gun was fired agin the British. He was a dreadful smart man, Cap'n Eb was, and driv team a good many years atween here and Boston. He married Lois Peabody, that was cousin to your grandfather then. Lois was a real sensible woman, and I've heard her tell the story as he told her, and it was just as he told it to me, just exactly, and I shall never forget it if I live to be 900 years old like Methuselah. You see, along back in them times, there used to be a feller come round these 'ere parts, spring and fall, a peddlin' goods, with his pack on his back, and his name was Jehiel Lomidoo. Nobody rightly knew where he come from. He wasn't much of a talker, but the women rather liked him, and kind of liked to have him round. Women will like some fellas, when men can't see no sort of reason why they should, and they liked this here Lomidoo, though he was kind of mournful and thin and shad-bellied, and hadn't nothing to say for himself. But it got to be so that the women would count and calculate so many weeks afore it was time for Lomidoo to be along, and they'd make up ginger snaps and preserves and pies, and make him stay to tea at their houses, and feed him up on the best there was. And the story went round that he was a-courtin' Phoebe Ann Parker, or Phoebe Ann was a-courtin' him, folks didn't rightly know which. Well, all of a sudden, Lomidoo stopped comin' round, and nobody knew why, only just he didn't come. It turned out that Phoebe Ann Parker had got a letter from him saying he'd be along afore Thanksgiving, but he didn't come, neither afore nor at Thanksgiving time, nor arter, nor next spring, and finally the women they gin up looking for him. Some said he was dead, some said he was gone to Canada, and some said he had gone over to the old country. Well, as to Phoebe Ann, she acted like a gal of sense, and married 'Bijah Moss, and thought no more about it. She took the right view on it, and said she was certain that all things was ordered out for the best, and it was just as well folks couldn't always have their own way. And so, in time, Lomidoo was going out of folks' mind, much as last year's apple blossom. It's really affecting to think how little these 'ere folks is missed that so much sot by. There ain't nobody, if there's ever so important, but what the world gets to going on without 'em, pretty much as it did with 'em, though there's some little flurry at first. Well, the last thing that was in anybody's mind was that they ever should hear from Lommy again. But there ain't nothing but what has its time a turning up, and it seems his turn was to come. Well, you see, 'twas the 19th of March when Captain Eb Swain started with a team for Boston. That day there come on about the biggest snowstorm that there'd been in them parts since the oldest man could remember. 'Twas this 'ere fine sifting snow that drives in your face like needles, with a wind to cut your nose off, and it made teamin' pretty tedious work. Captain Eb was about the toughest man in them parts. He'd spent days in the woods a-loggin', and he'd been up to the district of Maine a-lumberin', and was about up to any sort of thing a man generally could be up to, but these 'ere March winds sometimes does set on a fellow so that neither nature nor grace can stand 'em. The captain used to say he could stand any wind that blew one way at a time for 5 minutes, but come to winds that blew all 4 points at the same minute, why, they flustered him. Well, that was the sort of weather it was all day, and by sundown Captain Eb he got clean bewildered, so that he lost his road, and when night came on he didn't know nothing where he was. You see, the country was all under drift, and the air so thick with snow that he couldn't see a foot afore him, and the fact was he got off the Boston road without knowing it, and came out at a pair of bars nigh up Sherburne, where old Cack Sparrock's mill is. Your grandpa used to know old Cack, boys. He was a dreadful drinking old critter that lived there all alone in the woods by himself, attending saw and grist mill. He wasn't always just what he was then. Time was that Cack was a pretty considerably likely young man, and his wife was a very respectable woman. Deacon Amos Pettingale's daughter from Sherburne. But you see, the year arter his wife died, Cack he gi'n up going to meetings Sundays, and all the tithin' men and select men could do, they couldn't git him out to meetin', and when a man neglects means of grace and sanctuary privileges, they ain't no sayin' what he'll do next. Why, boys, just think on it. An immortal critter lying around loose all day Sunday, and not putting on so much as a clean shirt, when all 'spectable folks has on their best clothes, and is to meetin' worshipping the Lord. What can you 'spect to come of it, when he lies idling round in his old week-day clothes, fishin' or some such, but what the devil should be after him at last, as he was after old Cack? Here Sam winked impressively to my grandfather in the opposite corner, to call his attention to the moral which he was interweaving with his narrative. Well, you see, Captain Eb he told me that when he come to them bars and looked up and saw the dark a-comin' round, and the storm a-thickening up, he felt that things was getting pretty considerable serious. There was a dark piece of woods on ahead of him inside the bars, and he knew, come to get in there, the light would give out clean. So he just thought he'd take the hoss out of the team and go ahead a little and see where he was. So he driv his oxen up agin the fence and took out the hoss and got on him and pushed along through the woods, not rightly knowing where he was going. Well, afore long he see a light through the trees, and sure enough he come out to Cack Sparrock's old mill. It was a pretty considerably gloomy sort of place, that our old mill was. There was a great fall of water that come rushing down the rocks and fell in a deep pool, and it sounded sort of wild and lonesome, but Captain Eb he knocked on the door with his whip handle and got in. There, to be sure, sat old Cack beside a great blazing fire, with his rum jug at his elbow. He was a dreadful fellow to drink, Cack was. For all that, there was some good in him, for he was pleasant-spoken and obliging, and he made the captain welcome. You see, Cack, said Captain Eb, I'm off my road, and got snowed up down by your bars, says he. Want to know, says Cack. Calculate you'll just have to camp down here till morning, says he. Well, so old Cack he got out his tin lantern, and went with Captain Eb back to the bars to help him fetch along the critters. He told him he could put 'em under the mill shed. So they got the critters up to the shed and got the cart under, and by that time the storm was awful. But Cack, he made a great roaring fire, 'cause you see, Cack always had slab wood a-plenty from his mill, and a roaring fire is just so much company. It sort of keeps a fellow's spirits up, a good fire does. So Cack, he sot on his tea kettle and made a swingerin' lot of toddy, and he and Cap'n Eb were having a tolerable comfortable time there. Cack was a pretty good hand to tell stories, and Cap'n Eb weren't no way backward in that line, and kept up his end pretty well. And pretty soon they was a roaring and a haw-hiding inside about as loud as the storm outside, when all of a sudden, 'bout midnight, there come a loud rap on the door. "Lord massy, what's that?" says Cack. Folks is rather startled allers to be checked up sudden when they're a-carrying on and laughing, and it was such an awful blowy night it was a little scary to have a rap on the door. Well, they waited a minute and didn't hear nothing but the wind a-screeching round the chimney, and old Cack was just going on with his story when the rap come again, harder than ever, as if it'd shook the door open. "Well," says old Cack, "if 'tis the devil, we'd just as good's open and have it out with him to onst," says he. And so he got up and opened the door, and sure enough, there was old Kittery there. Expect you've heard your grandma tell about old Kittery. She used to come to meetings sometimes, and her husband was one of the praying Indians. But Kittery was one of the real wild sort, and you couldn't no more convert her than you could convert a wildcat or a panther. Lordy massy, Kittery used to come to meetin' and sit there on them Indian benches, and when the second bell was a-tollin', and when Parson Lothrop and his wife was comin' up the broadside, and everybody in the house riz up and stood, Kittery would sit there and look at 'em out of the corner of her eyes, and folks used to say she rattled them necklaces of rattlesnake tails and wildcat teeth, and such like heathen trumpery, and looked for all the world as if the spirit of the old serpent herself was in her. I've seen her sit and look at Lady Lothrop out of the corner of her eyes, and her old brown baggy neck would kind of twist and work, and her eyes they looked so that 'twas enough to scare a body. For all the world she looked just as if she was a-working up to spring at her. Lady Lothrop was just as kind to Kittery as she always was to every poor critter. She'd bow and smile as gracious to her when meetin' was over, and she come down the aisle, passin' out a meetin', but Kittery never took no notice. You see, Kittery's father was one of them great powwows down to Martha's Vineyard, and people used to say she was set apart, when she was a child, to the service of the devil. Anyway, she never could be made nothing of in a Christian way. She come down to Parson Lothrop's study once or twice to be catechized, but he couldn't get a word out of her, and she kind of seemed to sit scornful while he was a-talking. Folks said if it was in old times, Kittery wouldn't have been allowed to go on so. But Parson Lothrop's sort of mild. He let her take pretty much her own way. Everybody thought that Kittery was a witch. At least she knew considerable more'n she ought to know, and so they was kind of afraid on her. Cap'n Eb says he never see a fella seem scareder than Cack did when he see Kittery a-standing there. Why, you see, boys, she was as withered and wrinkled and brown as an old frosted pumpkin vine, and her little snaky eyes sparkled and snapped, and it made your head kind of dizzy to look at 'em, and folks used to say that anybody that Kittery got mad at was sure to get the worst of it first or last. And so, no matter what day or hour Kittery had a mind to rap at anybody's door, folks generally thought it was best to let her in. But then they never thought her coming was for any good, for she was just like the wind. She came when the fit was on her, she stayed just so long as it pleased her, and went when she got ready, and not before. Kittery understood English, and could talk it well enough, but always seemed to scorn it, and was allers mo' windin' mutterin' to herself in Indian, and winkin' and blinkin' as if she saw more folks round than you did, so that she weren't no way pleasant company. And yet everybody took good care to be polite to her. So old Cack asked her to come in, and didn't make no question where she come from, or what she come on, but he knew it was 12 good miles from where she lived to his hut, and the snow was drifted above her middle, and Cap'n Eb declared that there weren't no track, nor sign of a track, or anybody's coming through the snow next morning. "How did she get there, then?" said I. Didn't you never see brown leaves a-riding on the wind? Well, Cap'n Eb, he says, she came on the wind, and I'm sure it was strong enough to fetch her. But Cack, he got her down into the warm corner, and he poured her out a mug of hot toddy and give her, but you see her being there sort of stopped the conversation, for she sot there a-rocking backwards and forwards, a-sipping her toddy and a-muttering and looking up chimbley. Cap'n Eb says in all his born days he never heard such screeches and yells as the wind give over that chimbley, and old Cack got so frightened you could fairly hear his teeth chatter. But Cap'n Eb was a pretty brave man, and he weren't going to have conversation stopped by no woman, witch or no witch, and so when he see her muttering and looking up chimbley, he spoke up, and says he, "Well, Kittery, what do you see?" says he. "Come, out with it. Don't keep it to yourself." You see, Cap'n Eb was a hearty fellow, and then he was a little warmed up with the toddy. Then he said he see an evil kind of smile on Kittery's face. Then she rattled her necklace of bones and snakes' tails, and her eyes seemed to snap, and she looked up the chimney and called out, come down, let's see who you be." Then there was a scratching and a rumbling and a groan, and a pair of feet come down the chimney and stood right in the middle of the hearth, the toes pointing outwards, with shoes and silver buckles a-shining in the firelight. Cap'n Eb says he never come so near being scared in his life, and as to old Cack, he just wilted right down in his chair. Then old Kittery got up and reached her stick-up chimbley and called out louder, come down, let's see who you be." And sure enough, down came a pair of legs, and joined right on to the feet. Good fair legs they was, with ribbed stockings and leather breeches. "Well, we're in for it now," says Cap'n Eb. "Go it, Kittery, and let's have the rest on him." Kittery didn't seem to mind him, so she stood there as stiff as a stake and kept calling out, come down, let's see who you be." And then come down the body of a man with a brown coat and yellow vest, and joined right on to the legs, but there weren't no arms to it. Then Kittery shook her stick-up chimbley and called, come down, and there came down a pair of arms, and went on each side of the body, and there stood a man all finished, only there weren't no head on him. "Well, Kittery," says Cap'n Eb, "this here's getting serious. I spect you must finish him up, and let's see what he wants of us." Then Kittery called out once more, louder than ever, come down, let's see who you be." And sure enough, down comes a man's head, and settled on the shoulders straight enough. And Cap'n Eb, the minute he set eyes on him, knew he was Jehiel Lomidou. Old Cack knew him too, and he fell flat on his face and prayed the Lord to have mercy on his soul. But Cap'n Eb, he was forgetting to the bottom of matters, and not have his scare for nothing, so he says to him, "What do you want, now you have come?" The man, he didn't speak, he only sort of moaned, and pointed to the chimney. He seemed to try to speak, but couldn't, for you see it isn't often that his sort of folks is permitted to speak. But just then there came a screeching blast of wind, and blowed the door open, and blowed the smoke and fire all out into the room, and there seemed to be a whirlwind and darkness and moans and screeches, and when it all cleared up, Kittery and the man was both gone, and only old Cack lay on the ground, rolling and moaning as if he'd die. Well, Cap'n Eb picked him up and built up the fire, and sort of comforted him up, 'cause the critter was in distress of mind that was dreadful. The awful providence, you see, had awakened him, and his sin had been set home to his soul, and he was under such conviction that it all had to come out, how old Cack's father had murdered poor Lomidou for his money, and Cack had been privy to it, and helped his father build the body up in that very chimbley, and he said that he hadn't had neither peace nor rest since then. And that was what had driven him away from ordinances, for you know sinning will always make a man leave praying. Well, Cack didn't live but a day or two. Cap'n Eb, he got the minister of Sherburne and one of the selectmen down to see him, and they took his deposition.
And Parson Carrill, he prayed with him, and was faithful in setting home the providence to his soul, and so at the 11th hour poor old Cack might have got in. At least it looks a little like it. He was distressed to think he couldn't live to be hung. He sort of seemed to think that if he was fairly tried and hung, it would make it all square. He made Parson Carrill promise to have the old mill pulled down and bury the body, and after he was dead, they did it. Captain Ebb, he was one of a party of 8 that pulled down the chimney, and there, sure enough, was the skeleton of poor Limey. So there you see, boys, there can't be no inquiries so hid but what it'll come out. The wild Indians of the forest and the stormy winds and tempests joined together to bring out this year. For my part, said Aunt Lois sharply, I never believed that story. Why, Lois, said my grandmother, Captain Ed Sowen was a regular church member and a most respectable man. Law, mother, I don't doubt he thought so. I suppose he and Cat got drinking toddy together till he got asleep and dreamed it. I wouldn't believe such a thing if it did happen right before my face and eyes. I should only think I was crazy, that's all. Come, Lois, if I was you, I wouldn't talk so like a Sadducee, said my grandmother. What would become of all the accounts in Dr. Cotton Mather's Magnaly if folks were like you? Well, said Sam Lawson, drooping contemplatively over the coals and gazing into the fire, there's a pretty considerable side of things in this world that's true, and then again there's a side of things that ain't true. Now my old grandfather used to say, boys, says he, if you want to lead a pleasant and prosperous life, you must contrive always to keep just the happy medium between truth and falsehood. Now, that there's my doctrine. Aunt Lois knit severely. Boys, said Sam, don't you want to go down with me and get a mug of cider? Of course we did, and took down a basket to bring up some apples to roast. Boys, said Sam mysteriously while he was drawing the cider, you just ask your Aunt Lois to tell you what she knows about Ruth Sullivan. Why, what is it? Oh, you must ask her. These here folks that's so kind of topping about spirits and such, come sift 'em down, you generally finds they knows one story that kind of puzzles 'em. Now you mind and just ask your Aunt Lois about Ruth Sullivan. End of The Ghost in the Mill.